The boardroom fell into stunned silence as Dr. Sam Cooper unfolded the soil analysis report and placed it on the gleaming mahogany table. "This land isn't just farmland, Mr. Prescott. It's the solution to the water contamination that's been poisoning your company's developments for years." Rebecca Prescott, who had been disowned 6 months earlier for choosing a dirt farmer over her father's empire, watched as the color drained from her father's face when the Harvard-educated soil scientist continued, "And your daughter's fiancé is the only person who knows how to implement the remediation process that could save thousands of lives and your entire legacy." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The June heat shimmered across the rolling hills of Oakridge County, creating wavering mirages above the fields of wheat and corn that stretched toward the horizon. For Rebecca Prescott, each minute spent on the sun-drenched veranda of her father's estate felt like an eternity as she rehearsed the words that would likely sever her relationship with him forever. Rebecca checked her watch, a delicate platinum timepiece that had been her graduation gift from Princeton, as she sipped her iced tea and waited for her father to return from his conference call. At 28, with degrees in environmental science and business, she'd been groomed since childhood to eventually take over Prescott Development Corporation, one of the largest real estate development companies on the East Coast. "You're going to wear a hole in that deck if you keep pacing," said Maria, the estate's longtime housekeeper, her voice gentle but concerned. Having worked for the Prescotts since before Rebecca was born, Maria was more family than employee, providing warmth that had been largely absent since Rebecca's mother died when she was 12. Rebecca consciously stopped her nervous movement. "Just preparing for battle, all 30 versions of your speech that you practiced in your room last night." Maria attempted a small smile, briefly placing a reassuring hand on Rebecca's arm. The corner of Rebecca's mouth twitched upward, despite everything. 31. "I came up with a new opening while brushing my teeth this morning." "Oh? Is it better?" "Then starting with Dad, you know I've always respected your business acumen, but this time Rebecca actually laughed, a brief release of tension. "Marginally, but probably less likely to get me immediately cut off from the family fortune." Their banter couldn't fully mask the gravity of the situation. It had been 4 months since Rebecca had met Jack Thornton while conducting an environmental impact assessment for her father's company on land adjacent to the Thornton family farm. 4 months of increasingly serious feelings that had culminated in a relationship she could no longer hide from her father, especially now that she and Jack had made plans for their future together. The manila folder on the glass table contained her resignation letter from Prescott Development, the company she had been part of since completing her MBA 5 years earlier. The company that represented her inheritance, her legacy, and until recently, her entire planned future. "He'll come around eventually," Maria said, straightening the already perfect table setting. "Your father loves you, even if he doesn't always know how to show it." "It's not just about love, Maria," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying the steady determination she'd developed during years in boardrooms dominated by men who underestimated her. "It's about control. Dad doesn't just want my love, he wants my obedience, and marrying the owner of the one farm he hasn't been able to acquire for his new development doesn't exactly fit his vision of filial loyalty." The sound of tires on gravel announced her father's return. Rebecca's heart rate accelerated as the sleek black Bentley appeared at the end of the curved driveway. Harold Prescott emerged from the back seat while his driver retrieved his briefcase, a commanding figure at 62 with silver hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to having his decisions unchallenged. His tailored suit and deliberate movements projected authority, his expression revealing nothing but the constant calculation that had built his real estate empire. Perfect timing, Rebecca murmured, straightening her shoulders. The condemned enjoys one last lunch on the terrace before execution. Maria squeezed her arm supportively before retreating to the kitchen, leaving Rebecca to face her father alone. "The Thompson contract is finally settled," Harold announced as he joined her, accepting the glass of iced tea Maria had prepared. No greeting, no pleasantries. Business always came first. Their attorney attempted some last-minute negotiations, but our legal team held firm. He loosened his tie slightly, the only concession to the summer heat. "Where are we on the environmental assessment for the Westridge expansion?" This was her opening, though not the one she had planned. "That's actually something I need to discuss with you, Dad." Something in her tone caused him to look up from his phone, his attention momentarily diverted from the constant stream of business communications. "Problem with the EPA requirements?" "No. The assessment is complete and filed." Rebecca took a steadying breath. "I've placed my letter of resignation on your desk. Today will be my last day with Prescott Development." Harold's expression shifted from momentary confusion to sharp focus. "Is this about the board position? I told you, in 2 years." "It's not about the board position," Rebecca interrupted, an unusual assertiveness in her voice. "It's about me making a choice for my own life and future." Her father's eyes narrowed fractionally, his analytical mind processing this unexpected development. "Which competitor made an offer? If it's Westlake Enterprises, you should know they're over-leveraged on their last 3 projects, and I'm not joining a competitor." Rebecca maintained eye contact despite the urge to look away from his increasingly intense scrutiny. "I'm leaving the development industry entirely." "For what?" His tone remained controlled, but the slight tightening around his eyes revealed growing concern. "For a partnership in sustainable agriculture and environmental remediation." The words came out with practiced precision, and for a future with Jack Thornton. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to quiet as Harold Prescott processed this information with dangerous stillness. When he finally spoke, his voice had chilled 20 degrees. "The farmer whose property is blocking the northern access point for Westridge? The man who's refused every reasonable offer we've made. His control was precise but fragile. You're throwing away everything we've built for a fling with someone who plows dirt for a living?" "Jack doesn't just plow dirt, Dad. He holds patents on 3 soil remediation techniques that are being implemented across the country. He has a master's in agricultural science from Cornell and turned down multiple corporate offers to continue his family's farming tradition while innovating sustainable practices." Her voice strengthened as she defended Jack. "And it's not a fling. We're getting married in September." Harold set his glass down with deliberate care, the only outward sign of the emotion building beneath his controlled exterior. "I see." The 2 simple words carried volumes of disapproval. "And when were you planning to mention this alliance?" "I'm telling you now, directly and honestly." Rebecca maintained her composure, though her heart hammered in her chest. "I didn't make this decision lightly or quickly. I've spent months considering what I really want for my future." "Months?" His eyebrow raised fractionally. "So this deception has been ongoing while you've had access to all of our strategic planning for Westridge? Planning that directly involves acquiring the Thornton property?" The implications stung more than she had anticipated. "I've never shared confidential company information, and you know it. My integrity isn't contingent on whether I agree with your acquisition targets." "Integrity?" Harold's laugh held no humor. "You've been sleeping with the opposition while drawing a salary from this company, and you want to discuss integrity? That's unfair, and you know it." Rebecca's composure cracked slightly. "I've kept my personal and professional lives completely separate. I've fulfilled every responsibility to Prescott Development, completed every project assigned to me. I even disclosed the relationship to HR once it became serious. HR doesn't make strategic decisions about conflicts of interest. I do." Harold stood, signaling the end of the conversation from his perspective. If you want to play farmer's wife, that's your decision. But don't expect to maintain access to the resources of a company you've betrayed, or a family whose values you've rejected. The words hit with calculated precision. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying choices have consequences, Rebecca. His voice was steady, businesslike. You've chosen to align yourself with someone actively working against this family's interests. That choice carries financial and personal repercussions. Your company accounts will be frozen by end of business today. Your personal effects can be collected from your office and apartment under security supervision. Rebecca had prepared for anger, even disappointment, but the cold, transactional nature of his response shocked her. You're disowning me? Just like that? You disowned yourself the moment you decided your future lay with someone attempting to block a $500 million development. He straightened his cuffs, a habitual gesture when concluding business. When this infatuation inevitably ends, we can discuss terms for your return to the family and the company. Until then, you've made your choice clear. Without waiting for her response, Harold turned and walked back toward the house, his posture betraying no emotion. Only when he reached the door did he pause, without turning back. Your mother would have been profoundly disappointed. With eyes, that final calculated blow, he disappeared inside. Rebecca sat motionless, the magnitude of what had just occurred washing over her in waves. She had anticipated anger, perhaps even temporary estrangement, but the clinical severance of all ties exceeded even her worst projections. Maria emerged from where she had undoubtedly heard everything, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Nina, I'm so sorry. He doesn't mean it. When he calms down, he absolutely means it, Maria. Rebecca's voice sounded distant to her own ears. He meant every word. That wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a business decision. I became a liability, so he cut his losses. The housekeeper wrapped her arms around Rebecca's shoulders. This house will feel his regret in the silence after you're gone. Give him time to recognize his mistake. Rebecca returned the embrace briefly before pulling away with newfound resolve. I need to collect my things before security arrives to escort me out like a corporate spy. The bitter humor couldn't mask the pain in her voice. Apparently, becoming a farmer's fiancé makes me an immediate security threat to the family empire. Within 2 hours, Rebecca's life at Prescott Manor and Prescott Development had been clinically excised. Her office had been packed into boxes under the uncomfortable supervision of the company's head of security, a man who had known her since she was a teenager, now treating her as a potential corporate saboteur. Her company credit cards, building, access, and email had been deactivated with ruthless efficiency. By early evening, she pulled her BMW into the gravel driveway of the Thornton farmhouse, a century-old 2-story home surrounded by oak trees and well-tended gardens that stood in stark contrast to Prescott Manor's manicured perfection. The weathered wooden porch and white rocking chairs projected a warmth that suddenly felt more like home than the sterile luxury she had left behind. Jack emerged from the barn as she approached, immediately sensing something was wrong. At 34, Jack Thornton carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood his place in the world. His tall frame and sun-weathered features reflected years of outdoor work, while his thoughtful expression revealed the intellectual depth that had initially attracted Rebecca beyond his physical appeal. It didn't go well, he surmised, taking the single suitcase from her car. That's an understatement, Rebecca replied, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Apparently, I'm now officially disinherited, unemployed, and persona non grata at both the family estate and company headquarters. Jack's arm slipped around her shoulders, steady and reassuring. I'm sorry. I knew he'd be upset, but this seems extreme, even for Harold Prescott. He sees our relationship as a deliberate betrayal, corporate espionage disguised as romance. She leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his steadiness. According to my father, I've aligned myself with the opposition. Opposition to what? A fair market price for land that's been in my family for 4 generations. Jack's typical calm showed a rare crack of frustration. I've never refused to negotiate. I've simply declined his specific terms that would have given him control of the watershed. In his world, refusing any Prescott development offer is tantamount to declaration of war. Rebecca's bitter laugh held no humor. And now his daughter is sleeping with the enemy. The betrayal is unforgivable. They moved to the porch, settling into the rocking chairs that had witnessed generations of Thornton family discussions. The contrast between this setting and the formal terrace where she had faced her father couldn't have been more stark. Worn, wood instead of imported stone, the scent of nearby lavender replacing carefully cultivated roses, genuine comfort replacing strategic impression management. What happens now? Jack asked, his hand finding hers across the space between their chairs. Now I start over. Rebecca's voice found new determination beneath the hurt. I've got my personal savings, my education, and my experience. We move forward with our plans. For the Sustainable Agriculture Consultancy, I just hadn't planned on launching quite so immediately. Jack nodded, quiet for several moments, as the implications settled between them. Rebecca, if this is moving too fast because of your father's ultimatum, if you need time to reconsider, don't. She turned to face him fully. My father made his choice, and I've made mine. I didn't choose you as some rebellion against him. I chose you because your values align with mine in ways I didn't even realize were missing from my life until we met. Her hand tightened around his. The timing isn't what I planned, but the decision stands. As dusk settled over the Thornton farm, casting long shadows across fields that had sustained generations through both hardship and prosperity, Rebecca felt the weight of her father's rejection balanced against the certainty of her decision. The path forward would be more difficult than she had anticipated, but the rightness of her choice remained unshaken. 2 months later, Rebecca stood in the small office she and Jack had established in a converted storage room of the farmhouse, reviewing soil analysis reports spread across a repurposed dining table that served as her desk. The transition from corporate executive with unlimited resources to start-up entrepreneur had been challenging but invigorating. Their Sustainable Agriculture Consultancy had secured its first 3 clients. Small farms seeking to improve soil, health and water management, providing just enough income to justify her optimism about their future. The ringing phone interrupted her concentration, an unknown number with the area code from her hometown. She answered with the new business. Greeting they had practiced. Thornton Environmental Solutions. This is Rebecca. Ms. Prescott, this is Dr. Sam Cooper from the State Department of Environmental Protection. The voice was male, professional, with an urgency that immediately commanded her attention. I'm calling regarding concerning test results from the watershed adjacent to your fiancé's property, the area surrounding the proposed Westridge development. Rebecca's professional training immediately engaged, personal history temporarily set aside. What kind of test results, Dr. Cooper? We've detected elevated levels of PFAS compounds in groundwater samples, significantly above EPA advisory levels. Initial mapping suggests contamination flow from the old industrial site that Prescott Development purchased for the eastern section of Westridge. His voice maintained scientific detachment, but the implications were clear. I understand you previously worked for Prescott Development and conducted their initial environmental assessments. I did, but our testing showed contamination levels within acceptable parameters at that time. Her mind raced through the assessment protocols she had overseen. All results were submitted with the development application. I've reviewed those. Reports, Dr. Cooper confirmed. The concerning samples come from deeper aquifer testing we conducted after receiving reports of unusual plant die-off patterns in the watershed basin. The contamination appears to be from an underground plume that wasn't detected in standard testing depths. Rebecca's professional concern sharpened. A plume suggests ongoing migration. Have you confirmed the source? Preliminary analysis indicates the former Westridge manufacturing facility as the likely point of origin. The contamination profile matches industrial solvents used there until its closure 15 years ago. He paused. Prescott Development purchased that property 5 years ago, correct? Yes, along with surrounding parcels for the Westridge residential development. Rebecca's mind connected implications with practiced efficiency. Has Prescott Development been notified of these findings? That's actually why I'm calling you, Dr. Cooper replied. We've made 3 attempts to discuss these results with their environmental compliance team. Each time we've been redirected to their legal department, who insist all testing was properly conducted during acquisition and development planning. The response was exactly what Rebecca would have expected from her father's company, legal defensive positioning rather than environmental problem-solving. That sounds consistent with their standard procedure for potential liability issues. Ms. Prescott, this isn't just a liability issue. This is a serious public health concern. The contamination is approaching levels that would require us to issue water advisories for nearby communities, including areas where construction has already begun on Westridge homes. The implications crystallized immediately. Millions in potential, remediation costs, significant development delays, and possible legal action from homebuyers who had already purchased properties in the initial phase. From a business perspective, it was a nightmare scenario for any developer. I understand the severity, Dr. Cooper, but I'm no longer affiliated with Prescott Development. I'm not sure how I can help. Despite her words, Rebecca's mind was already analyzing potential approaches. Your fiancé's property sits at a critical junction in the watershed, Dr. Cooper explained. More importantly, I've reviewed Mr. Thornton's published research on bioremediation techniques for exactly the class of compounds we're detecting. His experimental remediation barriers could potentially prevent further spread while we address the source contamination. The connection became immediately clear. Jack's farm, which her father had been so determined to acquire, potentially held the key to containing a contamination crisis that threatened the entire Westridge development. The irony was almost too perfect. I see. Rebecca's response was measured despite the complex emotions brewing beneath. Have you discussed this with Jack directly? I've scheduled a meeting with him tomorrow morning. Given your background in environmental assessment and your complex history with Prescott Development, I thought it prudent to brief you separately first. The diplomatic phrasing acknowledged the personal dimension without directly referencing the family drama that had become something of an open secret in professional circles. I appreciate that consideration, Dr. Cooper. Would it be possible for me to review your findings before tomorrow's meeting? He agreed to email the reports immediately, ending the call with an expression of hope for productive collaboration despite the challenging circumstances. As Rebecca hung up, the implications expanded in concentric circles of professional, environmental, and personal significance. The contamination represented a serious environmental threat requiring immediate action. For Prescott Development, it presented potentially devastating financial and reputational damage. And personally, it created an unexpected intersection between her past and present, that would inevitably force interaction with the father who had cut her from his life. Jack returned from the fields an hour later, finding Rebecca surrounded by printed reports and digital maps on every available surface of their small office. She explained the situation with precise clarity, outlining both the environmental situation and the inevitable complications regarding her father's company. So the development that your father was willing to disown you over is now threatened by contamination that my research might help contain, Jack summarized, the irony not lost on him. And tomorrow morning, we're meeting with a state environmental official who essentially wants to determine if we're willing to help save your father's project. That's the situation in a nutshell. Rebecca's laugh held more stress than humor. The universe apparently has a very specific sense of irony. Jack studied her expression carefully. The real question is, how do you feel about potentially helping the company, and by extension the father, that cut you off without a second thought? It was the question Rebecca had been grappling with since ending the call with Dr. Cooper. Professionally, the contamination needs to be addressed regardless of who owns the property. Environmentally, the watershed protection is exactly the kind of work our company was founded to pursue. She paused, confronting the personal dimension. As for helping my father, I guess we'll see if he's capable of accepting help from the daughter he disowned and the farmer he couldn't buy out. The meeting with Dr. Sam Cooper the following morning took place at the County Environmental Office, neutral territory that allowed for scientific discussion without the complications of either the Thornton Farm or Prescott Development headquarters. The environmental scientist was younger than Rebecca had expected, early 40s, with the intense focus of someone dedicated to their field rather than career advancement. His presentation was methodical, the data compelling, and the implications unmistakable. Based on current migration patterns, the contamination will reach the main residential construction area within approximately 2 months, he concluded, indicating flow patterns on a watershed map. Standard remediation methods would require suspending construction for potentially a year or more while extraction and treatment systems are implemented. The cost would be substantial, not including potential liability issues for homes already sold. Jack studied the data with scientific precision, his expertise in soil systems evident in the targeted questions he asked. Your depth samples suggest the contamination is moving primarily through the clay layer at 30 to 40 feet. That's consistent with the geological surveys I conducted when installing our irrigation system. He indicated specific areas on the map. The gradient shifts here due to the underlying limestone formations, which is why my property's watershed impact is disproportionate to its size. Dr. Cooper nodded with evident appreciation for Jack's technical understanding. Exactly. Your property essentially functions as a natural funnel for groundwater movement throughout the basin, which is why the remediation approach you published last year could be particularly effective if implemented at these key junctures. He indicated 3 points where Jack's property interfaced with the contamination flow. The microbiological barrier system is still experimental, Jack cautioned. We've had promising results in controlled settings, but deploying at this scale would be unprecedented. But theoretically sound, Dr. Cooper countered, and potentially implementable within weeks rather than months, which could prevent the contamination from reaching the residential zones, while longer-term source remediation is addressed. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, shifting from scientific analysis to practical implementation considerations. Throughout, Rebecca contributed her environmental compliance expertise, identifying regulatory pathways and implementation frameworks that could expedite approval processes. The collaboration was seamless, their complementary knowledge creating a comprehensive approach that neither could have developed individually. As they concluded the technical discussion, Dr. Cooper closed his laptop with an expression that shifted from scientific to diplomatic. There's one additional aspect we need to address. Implementation will require cooperation from Prescott Development, both for access to portions of their property and potentially for funding aspects of the remediation. Have they indicated any willingness to engage constructively since your initial contacts? Rebecca asked, already anticipating the answer. Not yet. However, given the potential effectiveness of Mr. Thornton's approach and its significantly lower cost compared to traditional remediation, I believe a joint presentation of our findings might change their perspective. His gaze shifted between Rebecca and Jack, particularly if that presentation included both of you. The implication was clear. Rebecca's knowledge of the company and Jack's technical expertise would create the most compelling case for cooperation. It would also inevitably require direct interaction with Harold Prescott for the first time since their confrontation. Jack's hand found Rebecca's beneath the table, a silent question and offer of support combined. She returned the pressure with decision rather than hesitation. "We'll participate in the presentation," she confirmed. "This isn't about personal history, it's about environmental responsibility and protecting the broader community from contamination. Impacts." Dr. Cooper's relief was evident. "We'll arrange the meeting for early next week. My office will coordinate with Prescott Development's environmental compliance team." As they left the county building, Rebecca and Jack paused in the parking lot, the summer heat a physical representation of the intensity awaiting them. "Are you sure about this?" Jack asked quietly. "Facing your father again in a professional setting where he's essentially being told he needs our help." Rebecca considered the question carefully. 2 months ago, he framed our relationship as me betraying the family business for you. Now we have the opportunity to demonstrate that our work, the very partnership he dismissed, might save his development from environmental and financial disaster. Her smile held determination rather than vindictiveness. "Yes, I'm sure. This isn't about proving him wrong. It's about proving we were right about what matters." The weekend passed with intense preparation as Rebecca and Jack developed their presentation. Working side by side in their small office, they created a comprehensive approach that combined Jack's remediation technology with Rebecca's implementation expertise. The professional focus provided welcome distraction from the looming personal confrontation. Sunday evening found them on the farmhouse porch, the sunset painting the western sky in spectacular oranges and purples as they shared a quiet dinner. The peace of the setting contrasted sharply with the tension of their upcoming meeting. "Tell me about your father," Jack said unexpectedly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Not the businessman or the developer, the actual person. I've only ever seen the corporate version." Rebecca's fork paused midway to her mouth, surprised by the question. "Why do you want to know that now?" "Because tomorrow we'll be sitting across from him in a meeting that's professionally critical but personally complicated. I want to understand the man behind the boardroom facade." Jack's expression was thoughtful. "You rarely talk about him beyond his business decisions." Rebecca set her fork down, considering the question seriously. "He wasn't always the way he is now." She searched for words to describe the complicated reality of Harold Prescott. "When my mother was alive, there was a different side to him. He laughed more, worked less. He taught me to ride a bike and built me a treehouse himself instead of hiring someone." A distant memory surfaced. "On my 10th birthday, he cancelled a major business trip to be there when I blew out the candles. My mother was so surprised she actually cried." "What changed?" Jack asked gently. "Everything changed when she died. It was like he couldn't bear the vulnerability that came with loving someone that much, so he reinforced all his emotional walls and threw himself entirely into the business." Rebecca's voice softened with the weight of old grief. The company became his refuge, something he could control when he couldn't control cancer or death, or a 12-year-old daughter who kept crying at inconvenient times. Jack reached across the table, his hand covering hers. That explains a lot about how he reacted to your decision to leave the company. It wasn't just about the business. It was about losing control of the one thing he'd made the center of his life after your mother died. I never thought about it that way, Rebecca admitted. I've always seen his controlling behavior as pure business strategy, not emotional self-protection. The insight shifted something in her understanding of the man she would face tomorrow. That doesn't excuse how he treated me, but it makes his reaction more human. As darkness settled over the farm, the cicadas creating their nightly chorus, Rebecca found herself seeing her father through a slightly different lens, still the hard-driving businessman who had cut her off without apparent remorse, but also a man whose emotional armor had been forged in profound loss. "Thank you for asking about him," she said finally. "I think I needed that perspective before tomorrow." Jack nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. "Just remember, whatever happens in that meeting, you're not facing it alone anymore." The simple promise carried more comfort than elaborate reassurances could have offered. Monday morning arrived with perfect clarity, the summer sky an unblemished blue as Rebecca and Jack drove toward Prescott Development Headquarters. The gleaming glass and steel building towered over the business district, its imposing presence a physical manifestation of Harold Prescott's corporate power. As Rebecca had anticipated, the security desk hesitated when processing her visitor badge. The young guard, new since her departure, called for supervisor approval before reluctantly printing credentials for the former heir to the company, who now required escort to access the executive floor. The conference room selected for the presentation carried memories of countless strategy sessions Rebecca had led from the company side of the table. Now, as she arranged materials alongside Jack and Dr. Cooper, she found herself on the opposite side, both literally and figuratively. The reversal wasn't lost on her, though she maintained professional composure despite the surreal quality of the situation. The Prescott development team arrived with calculated precision: legal counsel, environmental compliance officers, project managers for Westridge, and finally, Harold Prescott himself. His entrance was exactly as Rebecca had anticipated, deliberately last, ensuring all attention focused on his arrival, his expression revealing nothing beyond professional assessment of the situation. His gaze passed over Rebecca with practiced neutrality, acknowledging her presence without emotional recognition, before focusing on Dr. Cooper as the presumed authority figure in the visitor group. The calculated slight was exactly what she had prepared for, reinforcing her decision to maintain absolute professionalism throughout the presentation. Dr. Cooper opened the meeting with diplomatic efficiency, outlining the contamination discovery, testing methodology, and regulatory implications, without placing blame or focusing on past assessments. His scientific detachment provided neutral foundation for the more technical portions of the presentation. When Jack took over to explain the contamination's movement through the watershed and his proposed remediation approach, Rebecca observed her father closely. Harold's expression remained impassive, but his focused attention revealed genuine interest in the technical solution being presented. Always the businessman, evaluating options and opportunities despite personal feelings. Rebecca's portion addressed implementation framework, regulatory compliance pathways, and cost projections, comparing Jack's approach to traditional remediation methods. Her presentation was precise, professional, and completely devoid of references to her previous role within the company or familial connections. She presented as a qualified environmental consultant, nothing more or less. As the presentation concluded, the room settled into evaluative silence. Harold Prescott remained the center of gravitational authority despite the presence of his executive team, all eyes turning to him for response direction. "The contamination data is concerning," he finally acknowledged, addressing Dr. Cooper directly while continuing to avoid eye contact with Rebecca. "Though I question why standard environmental assessment protocols failed to identify this issue during initial property evaluation and construction approval processes." The implied criticism was directed at the regulatory office but carried subtle undertones regarding Rebecca's previous work as environmental assessment lead. Dr. Cooper responded with professional clarity, explaining the unusual depth and migration pattern that standard testing protocols might have missed without specialized deep aquifer sampling. Harold turned his attention to Jack next, his assessment coolly analytical. "Your remediation approach is intriguing, Mr. Thornton, but appears largely theoretical based on limited laboratory implementation. What assurance can you provide regarding effectiveness at this scale?" Jack met the challenge with the quiet confidence that had initially attracted Rebecca. "The biological process isn't theoretical. It's well-established science for breaking down these specific compounds. My innovation is the delivery system and barrier implementation method, which has been successfully field-tested at 3 sites, though admittedly at smaller scale. Those tests showed 92% containment effectiveness," Rebecca added, providing specific data to support Jack's more general statement. "The full technical reports are included in your packets, including independent verification from State University's Environmental Engineering Department." Harold's gaze finally shifted to his daughter, acknowledging her directly for the first time. "And the implementation timeframe?" "Initial barriers could be established within 3 weeks, with full implementation completed in approximately 6 weeks," she responded, maintaining professional tone despite the personal undercurrents. "Compared to minimum 6 months for traditional pump-and-treat systems at roughly 30% of the cost," added Dr. Cooper, highlighting the financial advantage alongside the time savings. Harold nodded once, processing the information with business-like efficiency. "Our legal team will need to review liability implications, and our engineering department will want to verify implementation compatibility with existing construction schedules." His tone remained neutral, decisions clearly pending further internal analysis. "We'll require detailed implementation proposals and performance guarantees before proceeding." "Of course," Rebecca acknowledged, having anticipated these exact requirements. "We've prepared preliminary framework documents addressing those specific areas." She slid additional folders across the table with practiced precision. "Though timing remains critical given the contamination migration rate Dr. Cooper has documented." The meeting concluded with professional courtesy but without definitive commitment. As the Prescott development team filed out, Harold remained briefly behind, creating the momentary privacy that Rebecca had neither expected nor sought. "I assume you find this situation gratifying on some level," he observed, his tone revealing the first crack in his business facade. "Finding dangerous chemical contamination that threatens public health is never gratifying, Dad." Rebecca maintained professional composure despite the personal shift. "Neither is discovering it's heading toward homes where families plan to live." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Harold's voice lowered, ensuring privacy from the departing executives. The cosmic irony of Prescott development suddenly needing assistance from the very people I considered obstacles to our progress hasn't escaped me. I doubt it escaped you either. Rebecca met his gaze directly, neither confrontational nor submissive. "What I find meaningful is that the environmental work Jack and I believe in might help prevent a public health crisis and protect home buyers who trusted Prescott Development's reputation. The personal history is irrelevant to the environmental reality. Harold studied her with the calculated assessment that had built his business empire, seeming to truly see her for the first time since their confrontation. "You've changed," he observed, something unidentifiable shifting in his expression. "I've grown," Rebecca corrected gently. "There's a difference." The moment suspended between them, neither reconciliation nor continued rejection, but acknowledgement of something altered in their dynamic. Without further comment, Harold gathered his materials and departed, leaving Rebecca with the sense that while nothing had been resolved, something fundamental had shifted in ways she couldn't yet fully identify. 3 days passed without word. From Prescott Development, the silence increasingly concerning as each day brought the contamination plume closer to the residential development area. Rebecca and Jack continued their regular client work while waiting for a response, the uncertainty creating an undercurrent of tension beneath their daily activities. On Thursday afternoon, the unexpected sound of tires on gravel drew Rebecca to the farmhouse window. A sleek black Lexus SUV with Prescott Development markings had pulled into the driveway, not her father's Bentley, but a company vehicle nonetheless. From it emerged Victor Reynolds, her father's trusted chief operations officer and longtime friend of the family. "This is unexpected," she murmured to Jack, who had joined her at the window. "Victor never makes site visits personally unless something is critically important." Jack's expression remained calm but alert. "Should we be concerned?" "Not about Victor himself. He's always been fair, even when delivering difficult messages." Rebecca moved toward the door. "But his presence here suggests some significant development regarding our proposal." Victor Reynolds approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling complex business situations. At 58, his salt-and-pepper hair and athletic build projected experienced competence, the perfect operational counterpart to Harold Prescott's strategic authority. "Rebecca," he greeted her with genuine warmth as she stepped onto the porch. "It's good to see you despite the circumstances." His gaze shifted to include Jack, offering a professional handshake. "Mr. Thornton, I've heard impressive things about your remediation work." The personal greeting toward Rebecca and professional acknowledgement of Jack created interesting contrast to Harold's calculated distance. "It's good to see you too, Victor," Rebecca replied with sincere reciprocation. "This is unexpected. May I come in? I have some matters to discuss that would benefit from sitting down." Victor's tone remained cordial but carried undertones of seriousness that reinforced the significance of his visit. They settled in the farmhouse kitchen, the heart of the home rather than the small office, a conscious choice on Rebecca's part, to establish personal rather than purely professional context. Jack prepared coffee with the easy hospitality that came naturally to him, the domestic normality creating interesting counterpoint to the corporate gravity Victor represented. "I'll be direct," Victor began once they were seated. "The environmental assessment team has completed their review of your proposal. The technical evaluation was overwhelmingly positive. Your approach represents the most efficient and cost-effective solution to the contamination issue by significant margin." He paused, suggesting that technical approval wasn't the actual purpose of his visit. However, implementation has encountered certain resistance at the executive level. "My father," Rebecca translated simply, requiring no further explanation. Victor nodded, the slight tightening around his eyes confirming her assessment. "Harold has concerns about creating dependent business relationship with Thornton Property, given the ongoing acquisition negotiations and personal complications." The diplomatic phrasing barely masked the reality. Harold Prescott's pride was interfering with rational business decision-making. Rebecca had anticipated this possibility, but still felt disappointment settle in her chest. The contamination. doesn't care about personal complications, Victor. It's moving toward residential areas, regardless of who's involved in stopping it. I'm acutely aware, Victor acknowledged, his expression revealing genuine concern beneath professional composure. Which is why I've taken an extraordinary step of coming here directly rather than sending technical team for follow-up questions. Jack leaned forward slightly, his scientific focus engaging. Have there been changes in the contamination data or migration rate? Unfortunately, yes. New testing completed yesterday shows accelerated movement through the aquifer, likely due to higher than average rainfall this month, increasing groundwater flow rates. Conservative projections now suggest potential residential zone impact within 4 to 6 weeks rather than the original 2-month timeline. The revised timeline created new urgency that transcended personal and corporate politics. That changes everything, Rebecca observed, professional assessment engaging immediately. Traditional remediation systems couldn't possibly be implemented. In that time frame, even expedited approval processes take minimum 30 days for permitting a loan, which is precisely why I'm here despite certain instructions to pursue alternative options. Victor's careful phrasing suggested he was operating outside Harold's explicit directives. The technical reality has rendered other approaches effectively non-viable, regardless of organizational preferences. The implication was clear. Victor was pursuing Jack's remediation approach despite Harold's resistance, an unusual break from his typical corporate loyalty. "What exactly are you proposing?" Rebecca asked, recognizing the delicate position he had placed himself in, a modified implementation structure that addresses both technical requirements and organizational concerns. Victor removed several documents from his briefcase, placing them on the kitchen table. Prescott Development would contract directly with State University's Environmental Engineering Department for remediation implementation, with Mr. Thornton engaged as technical consultant through the university rather than direct contractual relationship. Ms. Prescott would interface with regulatory agencies through separate compliance consultancy. The structure was immediately transparent to Rebecca, a corporate workaround that would allow implementation of Jack's remediation system while providing Harold plausible deniability regarding direct business relationship with the daughter he had disowned and the farmer he couldn't buy out. The approach was technically sound but emotionally cowardly. "You're suggesting we hide our involvement behind institutional layers to protect my father's pride while using our expertise to save his development," Rebecca summarized with characteristic directness. "Is that about right?" Victor's expression reflected uncomfortable acknowledgement of her assessment. "I'm suggesting we find pathway that allows critically important environmental work to proceed despite certain personal complications that might otherwise prevent timely implementation." Jack studied the proposed structure with pragmatic focus. "The technical implementation remains essentially unchanged. My direct involvement in system installation and monitoring would be maintained, just structured through university relationship." "Exactly," Victor confirmed, apparently relieved by Jack's practical approach. "The university already has research relationship with your remediation techniques. This simply extends that framework to implementation context while addressing certain corporate concerns." Rebecca felt immediate resistance to the corporate shell game Victor was proposing, but her environmental expertise recognized the critical timeline implications. The contamination wouldn't wait for personal reconciliation or corporate straightforwardness. "And my father supports this arrangement?" she asked, already suspecting the answer. "Harold has authorized me to explore alternative implementation, structures that minimize external dependencies while maximizing technical efficacy," Victor quoted with diplomatic precision. "The details of that structure remain within my operational discretion." The carefully passed authorization confirmed Rebecca's assessment. Victor was operating within technical compliance of Harold's directives while deliberately creating implementation pathway that her father would likely find objectionable if presented directly. It represented both professional courage and personal loyalty that surprised her. "Why are you doing this, Victor?" she asked directly. "You've never gone against my father's wishes in 30 years of working together. This arrangement clearly circumvents his intent, even if it technically complies with his directives." Victor's professional expression softened slightly, revealing the family friend beneath the corporate executive. "Because I've watched Harold make exactly one serious mistake in 3 decades of otherwise impeccable business judgment, cutting you out of his life and the company. I won't be party to him making second critical error by rejecting the only viable solution to this contamination issue simply because of who developed it." The unexpected personal assessment created momentary silence in the farmhouse kitchen, the only sound the ticking of the antique wall clock that had kept time through generations of Thornton family decisions. The corporate politics had suddenly been pierced by simple human truth. Victor Reynolds saw clearly what Harold Prescott's pride prevented him from acknowledging. Jack was first to respond, pragmatic focus cutting through emotional complexity. "The technical implementation is what matters most. If this structure allows the remediation to proceed quickly enough to protect the watershed and residential areas, the contractual framework is secondary consideration." Rebecca studied the proposed structure again. Professional assessment temporarily, overriding personal reaction. The approach would indeed allow rapid implementation while navigating around her father's resistance. Whatever her feelings about the emotional cowardice involved, the environmental urgency was undeniable. How quickly could this be implemented through the university framework? Initial paperwork could be completed by end of week, with physical implementation beginning early next week, Victor replied, evident relief in his voice, as he recognized their provisional acceptance. The university's existing research permits for Mr. Thornton's remediation techniques simplify regulatory approval processes significantly. Rebecca and Jack exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them before she responded. "We'll agree to this arrangement given the accelerated contamination timeline and critical environmental implications. But this isn't long-term solution, Victor. At some point, my father will need to acknowledge reality rather than restructuring it to protect his pride. One environmental crisis at a time," Victor replied with diplomatic professionalism that didn't quite mask his agreement with her assessment. "The immediate technical implementation takes priority over longer-term organizational considerations." As they reviewed the detailed implementation documents, Rebecca felt complex mixture of emotions, professional satisfaction that their remediation approach would move forward, environmental relief that the contamination would be addressed in time, but also personal disappointment that her father remained unwilling to directly engage with the reality of their involvement. The structured distance reflected his continued inability to separate business necessity from personal pride, prioritizing appearance over substance, even when facing potential environmental disaster. What none of them could have anticipated was how quickly the carefully constructed corporate facade would collapse when faced with public health reality and unexpected complications that would force Harold Prescott to directly confront not just the contamination threat, but the daughter he had rejected and the farmer whose expertise suddenly represented his only viable path forward. Implementation began the following Monday with remarkable efficiency. The university framework providing streamlined access to resources and regulatory approval pathways that might have taken weeks through normal corporate channels. Jack's remediation system was installed at 3 critical juncture points where the Thornton property interfaced with contamination flow pathways. the specialized microbial barrier technology deployed with precision that reflected years of research and development. Rebecca coordinated regulatory compliance through separate consultancy, as Victor had proposed, maintaining professional distance from direct Prescott development interaction while ensuring all implementation met environmental standards. The arrangement functioned effectively from technical perspective, despite its emotional and corporate contortions. By Wednesday afternoon, all 3 primary barrier systems were operational, initial testing showing promising containment results. As specialized microbial colonies began breaking down contamination compounds while preventing further migration toward residential areas. The preliminary success created cautious optimism among the technical team, though regular monitoring would be required to confirm ongoing effectiveness. Rebecca was reviewing initial performance data in their farmhouse office when her phone rang. Dr. Cooper from the Environmental Protection Department, his voice carrying unusual urgency. "We've detected an anomaly in the contamination pattern that wasn't visible in our initial modeling," he explained after brief greeting. "A secondary plume appears to be moving through fractured bedrock beneath the primary clay layer, bypassing the current barrier locations through deeper geological pathways." The information created immediate concern, technical implications clear to Rebecca's experienced assessment. That suggests potential containment failure despite barrier effectiveness in primary pathways. "Have you mapped the secondary migration?" "A route preliminary mapping completed this morning," Dr. Cooper confirmed. "The deeper pathway follows different gradient due to underlying geological structure, potentially reaching residential areas sooner than the primary plume we've been tracking." "Where does this secondary pathway interface with the Thornton property?" Rebecca asked, mind already shifting toward implementation modifications that might address this new concern. "That's the significant complication," Dr. Cooper replied, his tone suggesting additional factors beyond technical adjustment. "It doesn't. The key interception point appears to be on Prescott development property, specifically within the eastern construction zone, where foundation work has already begun for luxury condominiums. The information created immediate implementation challenge. Barrier systems would need to be installed directly on active construction site rather than agricultural property, requiring immediate construction pause and direct Prescott development involvement, rather than the carefully structured arm's-length arrangement Victor had established. "How confident are you in this secondary pathway mapping?" Rebecca asked, already anticipating the corporate complications this would create. "Confident enough that I've scheduled emergency briefing with Prescott Development Executive Team tomorrow morning. The technical data is compelling, though additional confirmation testing would be beneficial." The situation had abruptly evolved, beyond the careful corporate workaround Victor had constructed, forcing direct confrontation with the contamination reality rather than organizational distancing. The secondary pathway would require immediate installation of barrier system within active construction zone, something that couldn't be managed through university framework without direct Prescott development authorization and involvement. "I'll need to attend that briefing," Rebecca confirmed, professional necessity overriding personal considerations. Jack's technical expertise regarding barrier installation in construction environment will be critical to implementation planning. "I anticipated as much," Dr. Cooper acknowledged. "Though I should warn you, Mr. Prescott specifically requested university representatives rather than direct consultant involvement when I mentioned the meeting requirement. He seemed particularly emphatic about implementation structure." The detail confirmed Rebecca's assessment. Her father remained determined to maintain technical distance despite escalating environmental urgency. The secondary pathway changes implementation requirements substantially, This can't be addressed through existing university framework without significant delays that timeline doesn't permit. That's precisely the technical reality I'll be presenting, Dr. Cooper confirmed, though I thought you should be prepared for potential resistance to direct involvement based on Mr. Prescott's initial reaction to meeting notification. After ending the call, Rebecca immediately contacted Jack, who was monitoring the existing barrier systems with university research assistance. The new information created significant implementation complications that would require complete recalibration of their approach and inevitably force direct engagement with Harold Prescott beyond the carefully structured distance Victor had established. As Jack returned to review the new data, the implications became increasingly clear. The environmental situation had evolved beyond corporate pride or personal estrangement. The secondary contamination pathway represented urgent public health concern that couldn't be addressed through organizational distancing or institutional layering. The technical reality would force direct confrontation between Harold Prescott, his disowned daughter, and the farmer whose expertise now represented the only viable solution to protecting his development and the families who would eventually live there. What neither Rebecca nor Jack could have anticipated was how dramatically this confrontation would unfold the following morning, transforming not just the implementation approach, but the fundamental relationship between father, daughter, and future son-in-law in ways that none of them could have predicted. Thursday morning dawned with ominous grey clouds gathering on the horizon, the weather reflecting the tension as Rebecca and Jack prepared for the emergency meeting at Prescott. Development. The discovery of the secondary contamination pathway had transformed their carefully structured arrangement into unavoidable direct confrontation, technical reality overriding corporate pride and personal estrangement. "Are you ready for this?" Jack asked, as they pulled into the visitor parking area of Prescott Development Headquarters. The question carried layers beyond mere professional preparation. Professionally, absolutely. Personally, Rebecca's voice trailed off as she studied the imposing building that had once represented her future. "Let's just say I'm prepared for resistance beyond technical objections." The security desk processed their visitor badges with visible discomfort, the guards clearly aware of Rebecca's complicated status. Their escort to the executive floor maintained professional courtesy that couldn't quite mask the awkwardness of the situation. The former heir returning as outside consultant under emergency circumstances. The executive conference room was already filled when they arrived. Dr. Cooper from the Environmental Department, Victor Reynolds, and the Prescott Development Executive Team, environmental engineers, construction managers, and at the head of the table, Harold Prescott himself. His expression revealed nothing as Rebecca and Jack entered, though the momentary stillness that settled over the room acknowledged the unusual circumstance of their presence. Dr. Cooper began without preamble, his scientific focus providing neutral starting point for the technically complex discussion. "Thank you all for accommodating this emergency session. New data has revealed significant complication to our contamination containment strategy that requires immediate assessment and response." The presentation that followed was methodical and compelling. Detailed mapping of the secondary contaminant plume moving through fractured bedrock beneath the primary clay layer, bypassing existing barrier systems through deeper geological pathways, and potentially reaching residential areas within 3 to 4 weeks. The technical information created immediate tension among the construction executives, whose timelines and budgets would be directly impacted by this new development. The critical interception point for this secondary pathway falls directly within the Eastern Construction Zone, Dr. Cooper concluded, indicating precise location on site maps where foundation work had already begun for luxury condominiums. Containment will require installation of specialized barrier system within active construction area rather than agricultural property, necessitating immediate construction pause at this location. How long would construction need to be suspended? Demanded Charles Miller, the Westridge project manager, his concern regarding timeline implications evident in his tone. Initial installation would require approximately 5 days, Jack responded, his expertise engaging, despite evident reluctance from some executives to acknowledge his authority. The barrier system could be incorporated into existing foundation, designed with minimal structural modification, allowing construction to resume with monitoring protocols in place. That assumes effectiveness comparable to agricultural implementation, observed Prescott's chief engineer with professional skepticism. Construction environment presents significantly different deployment conditions than controlled agricultural setting, which is precisely why direct implementation oversight by Mr. Thornton is essential rather than university proxy, Rebecca added, professional expertise asserting itself despite the personal complications. The technical adaptations required for construction environment demand specialized experience that can't be effectively delegated through institutional framework. The statement directly confronted the artificial separation Victor had established, bringing technical reality into conflict with organizational distancing. Harold Prescott's expression remained unreadable, though the slight tightening of his jaw revealed awareness of the implications. "What are the consequences of delay or alternative approaches?" asked James Bennett, Prescott Development's legal and counsel, clearly seeking options beyond immediate construction suspension and direct engagement with the Thorntons. Dr. Cooper's response was unequivocal. Based on current migration rate, contamination would reach residential areas within 26 to 32 days. At projected concentrations, this would trigger mandatory public health notification, potential evacuation, requirements for homes already occupied in adjacent development phases, and inevitable media coverage regarding contamination risks. The blunt assessment created momentary silence as executives processed the implications, not just construction delays, but potentially catastrophic public relations and legal liability issues that could devastate the company's reputation and financial stability. The technical reality had suddenly stripped away corporate positioning, leaving raw business crisis that transcended personal complications. Harold Prescott finally spoke, his voice carrying the controlled authority that had built his development empire. "Dr. Cooper, what confirmation exists regarding this secondary pathway beyond theoretical modeling? Have direct samples verified contaminant presence at projected locations?" The question reflected legitimate technical diligence rather than mere resistance, highlighting Harold's fundamental business thoroughness despite personal complications. The environmental scientist acknowledged the validity of the inquiry, explaining the limited direct sampling completed thus far while emphasizing the geological consistency with established contamination patterns. Additional confirmation testing would certainly strengthen predictive confidence, Dr. Cooper concluded, though testing timeline would consume days of critical response window if conducted sequentially before implementation decision. Jack leaned forward slightly, scientific, precision engaging. The barrier installation itself would provide definitive confirmation through monitoring systems incorporated into the design. Each barrier element includes detection components that would verify contamination presence while simultaneously addressing migration. The approach essentially combines confirmation and response in single implementation. The solution reflected Jack's innovative thinking, pragmatic problem-solving that acknowledged legitimate concerns while maintaining critical response timeline. Rebecca observed her father's reaction carefully, recognizing the subtle shift in his expression that suggested genuine intellectual engagement with the technical solution, despite personal resistance. And this barrier system, your system, Mr. Thornton, remains our only viable option, given the timeline constraints. Harold directed the question to Dr. Cooper rather than acknowledging Jack directly, maintaining psychological distance while pursuing necessary information. The only approach with demonstrated effectiveness against these specific compounds that could be implemented within required time frame, Dr. Cooper confirmed. Traditional remediation technologies would require minimum 60 to 90 days for permitting, installation and activation, well beyond projected residential impact timeline. Victor Reynolds interceded with diplomatic precision, attempting to navigate the corporate and personal complexities toward necessary action. Implementation would require direct oversight by Mr. Thornton, given specialized technical requirements, with Ms. Prescott coordinating regulatory compliance to ensure proper documentation. For liability protection, the statement directly acknowledged what Harold had been avoiding: the necessity of direct engagement with the daughter he had disowned and the farmer whose property he had failed to acquire. The carefully structured distance could no longer be maintained given the technical realities and timeline constraints. Harold's expression revealed nothing as he processed this information, though Rebecca recognized the calculating assessment behind his apparent impassivity, weighing business necessity against personal pride with the analytical precision that had built his corporate empire. How quickly could implementation begin? He finally asked, the question directed generally rather than to any specific individual. Equipment mobilization could begin today with appropriate authorization, Jack replied directly, professional focus overriding the personal dynamics. Initial installation could commence tomorrow morning, with expedited permitting through emergency response protocols Dr. Cooper has already initiated. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward Harold Prescott for final decision. The moment, suspended between technical necessity and personal resistance, business reality confronting emotional barriers that had seemed impenetrable just days earlier. Proceed with implementation planning, Harold finally stated, his decision precise and controlled, despite evident reluctance. Mr. Reynolds will coordinate necessary authorizations and resource allocation. Dr. Cooper, please ensure all regulatory documentation reflects emergency response status to expedite approval processes. The authorization represented clear business decision rather than personal reconciliation, but it nonetheless breached the absolute separation Harold had maintained since disowning Rebecca. Whatever his personal feelings, the contamination crisis had forced pragmatic engagement with the daughter he had rejected and the expertise she and Jack represented. As the meeting shifted toward implementation details, technical teams forming around specific aspects of the response plan, Harold rose from his seat with deliberate composure. Mr. Reynolds will oversee operational coordination. I have other matters requiring attention. The withdrawal was entirely characteristic, delegating implementation while maintaining personal distance, acknowledging technical necessity without emotional engagement. Rebecca had anticipated nothing different, though she still felt unexpected disappointment beneath her professional focus. As Harold moved toward the door, Jack's voice cut through the organizational discussion with surprising clarity. Mr. Prescott, there's a critical aspect of the implementation we should discuss privately. The unexpected direct address created momentary stillness in the room, executives pausing in their planning discussions to observe the unusual confrontation. Harold turned with practiced control, his expression revealing nothing beyond slight irritation at the delay. Mr. Reynolds can address any implementation details requiring executive approval. This concerns chemistry that doesn't appear in the official reports, Jack continued, his tone maintaining professional focus despite the personal undertones. Information your board members and shareholders would likely consider relevant to decision-making regarding this contamination response. The implication of undisclosed information created immediate tension among the executives present. Harold's expression shifted subtly, analytical assessment engaging beneath the controlled exterior. "My office," he stated simply, the brief direction carrying unmistakable authority despite its minimal wording. Rebecca exchanged quick glance with Jack, surprise evident in her expression despite attempts at professional neutrality. His responding look conveyed reassurance beneath determination. Whatever he intended, he had considered it carefully despite not discussing it with her beforehand. "You should both come," Harold added unexpectedly, his gaze briefly including Rebecca in the directive, before he turned and exited without waiting for response. The walk to Harold's office carried surreal quality for Rebecca, following the familiar path she had traversed hundreds of times as executive and daughter, now as outside consultant with uncertain status. Jack matched her pace beside her, his steady presence providing anchor amid the disorienting circumstances. Harold's office remained exactly as Rebecca remembered, meticulously organized, sparsely decorated with strategic awards and recognition. Rather than personal items, the wall of windows overlooking the city providing impressive backdrop to the massive desk that had always seemed physical manifestation of his authority. What additional information isn't reflected in the official reporting? Harold asked without preamble once the door closed behind them, his tone businesslike despite the personal tensions vibrating beneath the surface. Jack maintained professional composure despite the intimidating setting. The specific contamination profile suggests long-term leaching rather than recent migration. Environmental testing during original property acquisition would almost certainly have detected these compounds if standard protocols had been followed. His gaze remained steady despite the implication of his statement, which raises questions about whether initial environmental assessment was properly conducted or whether results were accurately reported to regulatory agencies. The allegation created immediate tension, its professional and legal implications unmistakable despite the measured delivery. Harold's expression hardened, corporate defensiveness engaging. Our environmental compliance procedures exceed regulatory requirements across all acquisition and development processes. All testing and reporting follow rigorous validation protocols. "I believe they do now," Jack acknowledged, surprising Rebecca with the careful precision of his response. But the historical acquisition of the Westridge manufacturing property 5 years ago occurred during different corporate circumstances. The technical profile suggests contamination that would have been identifiable through standard testing at that time, raising questions about either testing methodology or reporting accuracy. Harold's gaze shifted briefly toward Rebecca, the unspoken question evident in his expression. Had she shared inside information regarding historical compliance issues despite her claims of maintained confidentiality? Her own confusion provided silent answer, her lack of prior knowledge regarding Jack's unexpected approach evident in her expression. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Thornton?" Harold's voice carried dangerous edge beneath the controlled inquiry. "I'm suggesting that comprehensive review of historical testing documentation might reveal historical compliance gaps that could complicate current regulatory approach and potentially create significant liability exposure if discovered through external investigation." Jack's response remained professionally focused despite the high-stakes implications. Information that would be relevant to board members and shareholders when evaluating response options and associated risk factors. The statement landed with unmistakable impact, professionally worded but carrying clear undertones of potential leverage should Harold attempt to obstruct their involvement in the contamination response. Rebecca felt momentary shock at the unexpected approach, though she maintained composed exterior despite her surprise. Harold's expression revealed calculating assessment as he processed both technical implications and personal dynamics of the situation. After several moments of silence, he directed his response to Rebecca rather than Jack. "Did you provide Mr. Thornton with internal information regarding our historical compliance procedures?" "No," Rebecca replied immediately, professional integrity engaging despite the complex emotions. "I've maintained all confidentiality obligations regarding Prescott development operations and historical practices, as I stated when we last spoke." Harold's gaze shifted back to Jack, analytical assessment evident. "Then how exactly did you develop these theories regarding historical testing, Mr. Thornton?" "Through scientific analysis of the contamination profile itself," Jack responded, without hesitation. "The chemical signature, degradation patterns, and migration characteristics provide clear technical timeline that any environmental engineer could identify with appropriate analytical tools. The data speaks for itself, regardless of corporate documentation. The response was precisely accurate while carrying unmistakable implication. The scientific evidence existed independently of corporate reporting, creating potential verification pathway that transcended internal documentation. The leverage remained effective. Whether or not historical reports confirmed the technical assessment, Harold studied Jack with new intensity, reassessing the farmer he had dismissed as beneath serious consideration. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Thornton? Beyond implementation authorization we've already provided. Direct access to all construction areas without corporate oversight constraints, immediate resource allocation without bureaucratic delays, and Rebecca's full participation in implementation planning and regulatory coordination." Jack's response was immediate and specific, clearly prepared rather than improvised. The contamination timeline doesn't allow for organizational filtering or approval hierarchies that might prioritize corporate positioning over technical necessity. The request represented essentially unlimited operational authority within the contamination response, bypassing normal corporate protocols and reporting structures to enable immediate technical implementation without management interference. From corporate control perspective, it represented extraordinary concession of authority to outside consultants. Harold's expression revealed complex calculation beneath the controlled exterior, weighing legal vulnerability against operational necessity, reputation risk against implementation requirements, personal pride against business reality. The analysis played across his features in subtle shifts that Rebecca recognized from years of observing his decision processes. Authorized with standard confidentiality provisions regarding any historical documentation you might encounter during implementation, he finally stated, the decision reflecting pragmatic business assessment rather than personal surrender. Mr. Reynolds will ensure necessary organizational communication and resource coordination. The authorization represented significant professional victory despite its emotionless delivery, providing comprehensive implementation authority that would enable immediate response without corporate interference or delays. Jack nodded once, acknowledging the authorization with professional respect rather than personal triumph. Implementation will begin immediately. Daily progress reports will be provided to ensure appropriate management visibility. As Jack turned to leave, apparently considering the interaction concluded following the necessary authorization, Harold's voice stopped him with unexpected direction. "Mr. Thornton, I'd like a moment with my daughter privately. She'll join you shortly." The request created immediate tension, its personal nature contrasting sharply with the professional focus that had dominated their interaction thus far. Jack glanced toward Rebecca, silent question in his expression. Did she want him to remain, despite Harold's direction? Her slight nod provided reassurance that she could handle the conversation independently, professional confidence evident, beneath the personal uncertainty. As the door closed behind Jack, father and daughter faced each other directly for the first time since their confrontation on the terrace 2 months earlier. The corporate office setting created different context from that personal interaction, though the emotional undercurrents remained equally powerful despite the professional environment. That was an interesting approach from your fiancé, Harold observed, his tone carrying surprising absence of anger despite the implicit threat Jack's statements had contained. More strategic than I would have expected from an agricultural scientist. Jack is full of surprises, Rebecca replied carefully, uncertain where this conversation might lead, but maintaining professional composure despite the personal complexities. His scientific precision extends beyond soil chemistry to situational assessment. Harold studied her with the calculating intensity that had always characterized his business assessments, though something different lurked beneath the analytical surface. He was bluffing about the historical testing irregularities, wasn't he? Creating leverage through plausible scientific inference rather than actual evidence. The question created immediate ethical tension for Rebecca. Corporate loyalty versus relationship trust, professional integrity versus personal connection. The momentary hesitation in her response provided answer before she spoke. I believe in Jack's scientific assessment, she stated carefully, honoring both her integrity and her relationship while maintaining professional boundaries. Whether or not historical documentation confirms his conclusions isn't something either of us has verified. A surprising sound broke the tension. Harold's brief laugh carrying genuine rather than dismissive quality, the unexpected reaction catching Rebecca entirely off guard. He leveraged scientific credibility to create corporate uncertainty without actual evidence of historical misconduct, securing operational authority through strategic implication rather than direct confrontation. His assessment carried something that sounded remarkably like respect beneath the analytical observation. Impressive tactical approach for someone I dismissed as just a farmer. The acknowledgement created momentary speechlessness for Rebecca, its contrast with his previous dismissal of Jack so stark that she struggled to formulate appropriate response. Before she could gather her thoughts, Harold continued with unexpected directness. Your fiancé just demonstrated the exact strategic thinking I've spent decades trying to instill in potential executives, he observed. Moving to the window overlooking the city his developments had helped shape. Identifying leverage points, creating advantageous negotiating conditions, securing operational authority through implied rather than explicit pressure. He turned back toward her, expression complex beneath the controlled exterior. Not qualities typically associated with agricultural researchers. Jack understands systems, ecological, chemical, and apparently corporate, Rebecca replied, finding her voice despite the surprising turn in conversation. He sees connections others miss because he's trained to look beyond surface conditions to underlying patterns. Harold nodded slightly, acknowledgement rather than argument in his response. Qualities that would have made him valuable executive in development industry. Interesting he chose to apply them to sustainable agriculture instead. He chose what matters to him rather than what might be most financially advantageous, Rebecca stated, the parallel to her own choices unmistakable despite remaining unspoken. His priorities extend beyond quarterly profits or market position. The implied comparison created momentary tension, though Harold's response surprised her again. "Values clearly shared by his fiancé," he observed, the statement carrying unexpected absence of criticism despite referencing her rejection of the corporate path he had established for her. Another quality I apparently underestimated. The conversation had shifted into territory entirely different from what Rebecca had anticipated, creating uncertain footing despite her professional composure. "Dad, what exactly are we talking about here? Because this doesn't sound like the conversation I expected when you asked Jack to leave." Harold moved to his desk, removing leather portfolio from drawer with deliberate movements that suggested predetermined rather than spontaneous action. "I received Prescott Development's historical environmental testing records for the Oakridge manufacturing property acquisition this morning. Standard board disclosure preparation, given the contamination situation." He placed the portfolio on desk surface between them, its presence creating physical manifestation of the corporate documentation Jack had referenced. "I reviewed them personally before today's meeting." Rebecca maintained professional distance despite curiosity, uncertain where this disclosure might lead. "And your fiancé's scientific assessment was remarkably accurate despite his lack of access to historical documentation," Harold stated, his tone measured despite the significant implications. "The original testing appears to have been technically compromised in ways that misrepresented contamination levels, creating false compliance documentation that facilitated acquisition approval without appropriate remediation requirements." The admission carried enormous professional and legal implications, acknowledgement of historical compliance failures that could create massive liability exposure and potential regulatory penalties if publicly disclosed. The corporate vulnerability Jack had leveraged apparently existed in precisely the form he had scientifically inferred, despite lacking direct evidence. "That creates significant liability exposure," Rebecca observed, professional assessment engaging despite personal complications. "Both financial and potentially criminal if regulatory agencies determine intentional reporting manipulation." "Precisely why your fiancé's leverage was immediately effective, despite its indirect application," Harold confirmed, his expression reflecting combination of professional concern and unexpected respect. The technical reality supported his inference. Regardless of whether he could access documentation confirmation, Rebecca maintained careful neutrality despite the significant revelations. "Why are you sharing this with me? This creates potential conflict, given my current role in regulatory compliance coordination for the remediation implementation." Harold's response carried unexpected directness beneath the professional exterior. "Because the historical testing documentation contains signature authorization from the senior environmental compliance officer who oversaw the acquisition process, Caroline Mitchell." The name created immediate recognition for Rebecca, her first mentor at Prescott Development, and subsequent primary advocate within the executive team. Caroline's signature is on the compromised testing documentation. That seems impossible, given her reputation for absolute compliance integrity. "Her electronic signature appears on the documents," Harold confirmed, careful distinction evident in his wording, though timestamp analysis suggests authorization occurred during her medical leave following cardiac event 5 years ago, when she was hospitalized and physically unable to access corporate systems. The implication crystallized with disturbing clarity. Someone had apparently used Caroline's authentication credentials during her absence to approve compromised testing documentation, creating false compliance verification that enabled acquisition. Without appropriate remediation requirements, the fraud carried both corporate liability and potential criminal implications depending on authorization circumstances. who had access to Caroline's authentication credentials during her medical leave? Rebecca asked, though she already suspected the answer given Harold's unusual transparency regarding this sensitive corporate vulnerability. Only 2 executives maintained emergency access authorization during her absence, myself and Victor Reynolds. Harold's response carried matter-of-fact quality despite its enormous implications, creating significant question regarding historical authorization that would inevitably arise during any detailed investigation of the contamination situation. The disclosure created stunned silence as Rebecca processed its implications. Her father had just revealed potential criminal liability involving either himself or his most trusted executive, information that carried enormous personal and professional consequences if disclosed beyond their conversation. The transparency seemed entirely inconsistent with his previous approach toward both the contamination situation and their personal estrangement. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked, genuine confusion evident beneath her professional composure. "This creates significant vulnerability that my regulatory role could potentially expose, directly contradicting the confidentiality provisions you just established with Jack." Harold studied her with complex expression that contained something beyond the analytical assessment that typically characterized his interactions. "Because despite our current complicated circumstances, I trust your integrity regarding how this information might be utilized to address the contamination situation without creating unnecessary corporate or personal destruction." The statement represented extraordinary acknowledgement, professional respect, transcending personal estrangement, trust existing despite apparent relationship rupture. The contradiction with his previous rejection created disorienting contrast that Rebecca struggled to reconcile with her understanding of her father's character and their current relationship status. "That trust seems inconsistent with disowning me 2 months ago," she observed, directness engaging despite potential consequences. "What changed?" Harold moved to the window again, the cityscape providing background for his unexpected reflection. "Watching you present the remediation approach earlier this week, professional, precise, completely focused on technical solution rather than personal conflict despite how I had treated you." His gaze remained on the horizon rather than turning toward her. It reminded me of another environmental specialist I once knew who maintained absolute professional integrity despite personal pressures. The reference to her mother created immediate, emotional resonance, the unexpected connection between past and present creating powerful context for his unusual transparency. Rebecca's mother had been environmental compliance specialist before cancer claimed her life. Her professional reputation built on uncompromising integrity regardless of corporate pressures or financial implications. Mom would have caught the testing irregularities, Rebecca stated with quiet certainty, the observation carrying multiple layers of meaning beyond its factual accuracy. "Without question," Harold acknowledged, turning back toward her with uncharacteristic emotional transparency. Beneath his professional exterior, she would also have been immensely proud of the professional you've become, regardless of whether you followed the corporate path I established or created your own direction based on your values. The statement landed with powerful impact, its simple acknowledgement carrying healing potential despite the complicated circumstances surrounding their current interaction. Before Rebecca could formulate response, Harold continued with unexpected directness. "I handled our last conversation poorly," he stated, precision evident despite the personal subject matter, "responding to perceived rejection of my plans for your future with reciprocal rejection, rather than attempting to understand your actual priorities." The acknowledgement stopped short of apology, but nonetheless represented significant shift from his previous position. Not my most strategic leadership decision. Rebecca felt momentary speechlessness at this unexpected opening, the corporate framing of personal situation entirely characteristic of her father, despite its unusual emotional content. That's certainly one way to describe disowning your only child for choosing her own path, she finally responded, wry humor engaging despite the serious subject matter. Harold's expression suggested momentary discomfort before professional focus reasserted itself. The contamination situation requires immediate attention, regardless of these personal considerations. Your expertise and Mr. Thornton's remediation system represent our only viable response option, given timeline constraints and technical complexities. The transition back to professional focus provided familiar territory despite the emotional undercurrents, allowing Rebecca to engage with confidence despite uncertainty regarding their personal relationship. We'll implement immediately with the authorization you've provided. Daily progress reports will keep you informed of technical developments and timeline projections. I'd prefer more direct involvement than written reports, Harold responded, surprising her again with this deviation from the arm's-length approach he had previously established. The liability implications alone warrant closer executive monitoring than delegated oversight would provide. Rebecca maintained professional composure despite her surprise at this apparent shift. Of course, whatever monitoring approach you consider appropriate given the situation's sensitivity. I'll visit the implementation site tomorrow morning, Harold stated, the decision apparently already determined despite the conversational framing. Perhaps you and Mr. Thornton could provide personal tour of the remediation system and technical approach. The request represented extraordinary shift from organizational distancing toward direct engagement, personal involvement rather than delegated oversight, direct interaction rather than institutional separation. The contrast with his previous approach created momentary confusion despite Rebecca's professional focus. We'd be happy to explain the implementation approach on site, she confirmed, maintaining careful neutrality despite her uncertainty regarding his motivations for this unexpected engagement. Jack can demonstrate the barrier system components and monitoring technology directly. Harold nodded, apparent satisfaction with this arrangement evident in his expression. Excellent. I'll have Mr. Reynolds coordinate scheduling details. Moved toward the door, traditional signal that corporate meetings had reached conclusion. Oh, and Rebecca. Yes, she replied, pausing in her preparations to leave. Perhaps afterward, the three of us might have lunch, he suggested, the casual delivery contrasting sharply with the significant relationship implications. I should probably get to know the man my daughter has chosen to marry, given his evident strategic capabilities and technical expertise. The statement stopped short of explicit reconciliation, but nonetheless represented remarkable shift from his previous absolute rejection. Rebecca maintained composed exterior despite the emotional impact of this unexpected opening. I think that could be arranged, she replied carefully, neither assuming complete reconciliation nor rejecting the significant step the invitation represented. I'll check with Jack regarding his availability. Do that, Harold confirmed. Professional. Focus providing comfortable framework for this personal terrain. We have much to discuss beyond mere contamination response, it appears. As Rebecca exited his office, the conversation replaying in her mind with surreal quality, she found Jack waiting near the executive reception area, his expression reflecting concern beneath the professional composure. Everything okay? He asked quietly, the personal question maintaining appropriate discretion within the corporate environment. I think so, Rebecca replied, genuine uncertainty beneath her response. Despite its positive direction, though okay seems inadequate description for whatever just happened in there. We got implementation authorization, Jack confirmed, seeking professional clarity amid apparent personal complications. That's what matters most, given the contamination timeline. We got more than implementation authorization, Rebecca responded, still processing the remarkable shift in her father's approach. We got invited to lunch after tomorrow's site tour. Jack's expression revealed momentary confusion before comprehension dawned. Your father wants to have lunch? With both of us? Voluntarily? Apparently he's decided he should get to know the man his daughter has chosen to marry, Rebecca confirmed, the quoted words carrying significant weight despite their casual delivery. Particularly given your impressive strategic capabilities in leveraging scientific inference into corporate authorization. Jack had grace to look momentarily uncomfortable despite the successful outcome of his approach. About that, I should probably have discussed that strategy with you beforehand. The contamination timeline created urgency that seemed to justify direct approach rather than cautious positioning. Your strategy worked remarkably well, Rebecca acknowledged, steering them toward the elevator with professional discretion despite the personal conversation. Though next time, perhaps mention you're planning to essentially threaten my father with potential evidence of corporate malfeasance before actually doing so in meeting. Fair point, Jack conceded with characteristic thoughtfulness. Not my most collaborative moment despite the effective outcome. Rebecca pressed the elevator button before responding with unexpected lightness despite the morning's intensity. You can make it up to me by joining what promises to be the most awkward lunch in recorded history tomorrow, assuming we survive. The site tour with my father asking endless technical questions while pretending he's not evaluating everything about you beyond your remediation expertise. The elevator doors opened, providing momentary privacy as they entered empty car for descent to lobby. Jack's hand found hers as the doors closed, the simple connection providing anchor amid the morning's emotional and professional complexities. Think he'll ever actually approve of me, or just reach state of strategic tolerance given the circumstances? The question carried lightness despite its underlying significance. Rebecca considered carefully before responding. Honesty engaging, despite uncertainty regarding the future relationship dynamics. I think he just discovered you're much more than just a farmer, strategically, intellectually, and apparently in relation to my happiness. Her fingers tightened briefly around his. Which means you've already exceeded his expectations in ways he's still processing. Setting extremely low expectations does make exceeding them easier, Jack observed with dry humor that had drawn her to him from their earliest interactions. Perhaps not most romantic foundation for father-in-law relationship, but I'll take strategic tolerance over active hostility as starting point. As they exited the corporate headquarters, stepping into sunshine that had replaced the morning's threatening clouds, Rebecca felt cautious optimism beneath the professional focus that would dominate the coming days of contamination response. The path forward remained complex, environmentally, professionally, and personally, but the initial breach in her father's absolute rejection had created possibility that seemed inconceivable just days earlier. What none of them could have predicted was how the contamination response would ultimately transform not just the soil beneath Prescott Development's project, but the relationships between father, daughter, and future son-in-law in ways that transcended mere tolerance toward genuine understanding and unexpected respect. The truth he discovered wasn't simply about Jack's scientific expertise or strategic capabilities, but about the fundamental integrity and values that had drawn Rebecca away from corporate wealth towards sustainable partnership, qualities her father would gradually recognize as reflections of principles he had once shared with his wife before. Grief and ambition narrowed his perception of success to merely financial metrics and corporate expansion. The journey toward that understanding would begin with tomorrow's site visit and awkward lunch, continuing through contamination response that would demonstrate in practical terms what Rebecca had tried to explain in their terrace confrontation months earlier. That choosing Jack represented embracing values rather than rejecting family, finding purpose rather than abandoning responsibility, and ultimately honoring the principles her mother had embodied rather than merely accumulating the wealth and power that had become Harold's substitute for genuine fulfillment following her death. 1 year later, the sprawling grounds of the Thornton farm were transformed. White tents dotted the landscape, fairy lights strung between centuries-old oak trees, and elegant floral arrangements featuring native wildflowers created a perfect blend of sophistication and natural beauty. It was Rebecca and Jack's wedding day, a celebration that once seemed impossible given the circumstances of their engagement. Rebecca stood at the farmhouse window, watching guests arrive along the gravel driveway that had been meticulously landscaped for the occasion. Her wedding dress, a simple but elegant design that complemented the farm setting while honoring her refined upbringing, caught the late afternoon sunlight as she turned toward Maria, who was adjusting the final details of her appearance. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here?" Rebecca asked the woman, who had been more mother than housekeeper throughout her life. "A year ago, I was disowned, and starting over in that tiny office Jack converted from a storage room." Maria's eyes glistened with happy tears. "Life has a way of bringing us where we belong, Nina, sometimes through strange and difficult paths." A soft knock at the door announced her father's arrival. Harold Prescott entered with uncharacteristic hesitation, the confident businessman momentarily replaced by a father seeing his daughter as a bride for the first time. His sharp intake of breath communicated more than words ever could. "You look exactly like your mother," he said simply, emotion making his voice rougher than usual. The statement carried profound weight, the highest compliment Harold could offer, and acknowledgement of the woman whose absence had shaped both their lives in different ways. Rebecca felt tears threatening to spoil her carefully applied makeup. "I'll leave you two alone," Maria said, squeezing Rebecca's hand before departing with emotional efficiency. Harold moved further into the room, his tailored suit a reminder of the corporate world that now existed alongside, rather than in opposition, to the farm where his daughter had found her future. "I have something for you," he said, removing a small velvet box from his pocket. "Your mother wore these on our wedding day." Inside lay a pair of sapphire earrings, elegant, timeless pieces that Rebecca remembered from childhood photographs. "Dad, I thought these were in the safety deposit box with all of Mom's things." "They were," Harold confirmed. "I haven't opened that box since she died. It seemed time." The simple statement revealed profound healing in a man who had locked away his grief alongside his wife's possessions for 16 years. As Rebecca put on the earrings, she recognized this gesture represented far more than wedding jewelry. It symbolized Harold finally opening the emotional walls he had constructed after his greatest loss. "I owe you an apology," Harold continued, the words clearly difficult for a man accustomed to authority rather than admission. "Not just for how I reacted to your engagement, but for trying to make you build your life according to my plans rather than your own dreams." Rebecca blinked, back tears. "Dad, let me finish," he said gently. "The contamination crisis forced me to see what I'd been missing, that you'd grown into an extraordinary woman with judgment far better than mine in many ways. Your mother would have recognized that immediately. It took me nearly losing you entirely to see it." Outside, guests continued to arrive, a unique blend of corporate executives from Prescott Development alongside farmers and agricultural scientists who had become part of Rebecca and Jack's professional network. The once separate worlds now intermingled in unexpected harmony. "The past year hasn't been easy," Rebecca acknowledged, remembering the careful rebuilding of trust through professional collaboration before personal reconciliation could truly begin. But I think we're in a better place now than we would have been if everything had gone according to your original plan. Harold nodded, uncharacteristic humility in his expression. Your young man proved that rather definitively. I never would have discovered the compliance issues if he hadn't forced direct involvement in the remediation process. The contamination response had ultimately revealed historical testing manipulation conducted by a mid-level manager who had used Caroline Mitchell's credentials during her medical absence. Neither Harold nor Victor had been directly involved, though corporate oversight failures had enabled the situation. The discovery had led to comprehensive compliance restructuring throughout Prescott development, with Rebecca eventually consulting on improved environmental protocols that protected both communities and the company's long-term interests. Jack, as a way of seeing beneath the surface, Rebecca replied with a smile. In soil and in people. A quality I've come to appreciate, Harold admitted, though I still maintain he would have made an exceptional corporate executive. He's exactly where he belongs, Rebecca countered gently. We both are. Their partnership had flourished in unexpected ways following the contamination crisis. Thornton Environmental Solutions had expanded beyond its modest beginnings, developing specialized remediation techniques for agricultural and development properties throughout the region. Their innovative approach had attracted attention from both environmental agencies and development companies seeking sustainable solutions to complex contamination issues. Most surprisingly, Prescott Development had become one of their primary clients, Harold recognizing the business advantage of incorporating advanced environmental practices into development planning rather than addressing issues after they emerged. The professional relationship had gradually enabled personal reconciliation, business collaboration, providing foundation for emotional healing that direct confrontation could never have achieved. It's time, came a voice from the doorway. Jack's mother, Susan, who had welcomed Rebecca into the Thornton family with immediate warmth despite the complicated circumstances of their engagement. Everyone's ready. Harold offered his arm to his daughter with formal dignity that couldn't mask his emotional investment in the moment. Shall we? The ceremony took place beneath ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of Thornton family history. Now they would observe the beginning of a new chapter that united seemingly opposite worlds: development and agriculture, corporate, wealth and sustainable farming, ambition and stewardship. Jack waited at the simple altar, his expression transforming as Rebecca appeared on her father's arm. His quiet strength and intellectual depth remained unchanged from when they had first met, though his confidence had grown through the professional challenges they had navigated together. Beside him stood his grandfather Thomas. At 92, the eldest Thornton represented the family legacy that would continue through this unexpected union. As Harold placed Rebecca's hand in Jack's, the symbolic gesture carried weight beyond traditional ceremony, corporate power willingly connecting with agricultural heritage, acknowledging the validity of a path different from what he had envisioned for his daughter. The transformation from rejection to blessing had required crisis, confrontation, and ultimately recognition of values that transcended business metrics or social expectations. The ceremony blended traditions, elements of corporate precision, alongside agricultural simplicity, sophisticated music paired with readings about stewardship and sustainability. The contrast created perfect representation of the bridge Rebecca and Jack had built between seemingly incompatible worlds. When they exchanged vows, Rebecca caught sight of her father wiping away unexpected tears, the controlled businessman momentarily yielding to genuine emotion. Beside him sat Maria, who had insisted on attending as guest rather than staff, despite her decades of service to the Prescott family. Next to her was Victor Reynolds, whose diplomatic skills had helped navigate the complicated territory between corporate interests and family reconciliation throughout the challenging year. As Rebecca and Jack sealed their vows with a kiss, applause rippled through the gathered community. Colleagues, neighbors, friends, and family celebrating not just marriage, but the union of different approaches to creating meaningful legacy. The reception beneath elegant tents featured farm-to-table cuisine prepared from Thornton harvests, alongside wines from vineyards developed on previously contaminated land they had helped remediate. The symbolic meal represented their professional partnership as much as their personal union, transformation of damaged resources into sustainable nourishment. Harold Prescott's toast surprised those who knew him only as ruthless businessman. When Rebecca first told me about Jack, I made the mistake of seeing only what he wasn't: a corporate executive, a development professional, someone following the path I had established, he acknowledged with remarkable candor. What I failed to see was what he is: brilliant, principled, innovative, and most importantly, someone who recognized the extraordinary woman my daughter had become when I was still seeing the child I wanted to protect. His gaze moved between the newlyweds with genuine warmth that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Together, you've shown that seeming opposites, development and preservation, progress and sustainability, ambition and stewardship, aren't actually opposing forces, but complementary strengths when approached with integrity and vision. The words reflected profound evolution in a man who had once defined success solely through corporate metrics and financial acquisition. The contamination crisis had forced him to recognize different forms of wealth and legacy beyond what could be calculated on quarterly reports or displayed in corporate headquarters. As evening settled over the celebration, Rebecca and Jack found a moment alone beneath the same porch where they had sat the night she arrived with a single suitcase, having been disowned for choosing love over corporate inheritance. "Think you'll regret not getting that corner office your father promised?" Jack asked, with the gentle humor that had sustained them through challenging months of remediation work and family reconciliation. Rebecca glanced toward the gathering, where her father was engaged in animated conversation with Jack's grandfather, the real estate developer and the traditional farmer, finding unexpected common ground in their shared commitment to family legacy, despite different expressions of that value. "I think we've built something better than any corporate office," she replied, leaning into her husband's steady embrace, "something that honors both our pasts while creating future neither of us could have imagined alone." In the distance, solar-powered lights illuminated the advanced remediation system they had designed together, technology that had not only saved Prescott development from environmental disaster, but evolved into innovative approach for sustainable development throughout the region. The contamination that had threatened to destroy relationships had instead become catalyst for healing waters that nourished both the land and the family connections once thought irreparably damaged. The truth Harold Prescott discovered wasn't just about Jack's expertise or Rebecca's determination, but about different forms of wealth, legacy, and success that transcended balance sheets or corporate acquisitions. In losing his daughter, he had been forced to recognize what truly mattered. In finding her again, he discovered dimensions of fulfillment his narrow corporate focus had never permitted him to see. If this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed, because every day we bring you emotional, true stories about family, healing, and reconciliation that the mainstream media ignores. Tomorrow's story will touch your heart in ways you never expected.